in the middle to get some of that stuff in terms of its importance. And then, years later, they catch up on the coasts. At least that's been the case in your work, which suddenly got some of these things noticed.
Yeah, it's I'll say this, being an academic who's lived in a small town, is from rural America and doesn't hate rural America is definitely puts me in a weird spot
Yeah,
because most of my academic friends, came from a different background, let's say, than I did
yeah,
economically.
to put it
And
mildly.
yeah, I'm a first gen college student. I was on free lunch when I was in high school and in grade school. I didn't come from much,
Yeah,
and so I think it gives me a much different perspective. A lot of academics come from a very blue blooded background.
sure.
One parent was an academic or two, and they come from third generation college student or more, and they live in Boston or Philadelphia or New York, and I didn't come from that, so I've always felt sort of like an outsider in academia because of all those things, really.
Yeah, well, it's good because your book, your work, your book, and also these articles I read and this research by you, I think has to come from that place, which is why you notice these things, which are huge trends that I feel often the more secular East Coast, West Coast folks literally don't notice until they lose the next election.
Listen, I don't want to be like bagging on the media because I talk to the media a lot, but
Yeah.
a lot of them don't understand religion.
No, not at all.
They don't understand it as they almost understand it as like you would understand like what team you root for. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? Or like some sort of like identity like that. They don't understand it like as a lived experience, as like part of an identity. And I think my job is to kind of step in and say, hey, evangelicals are not as monolithic as you think they are. They're not as
Yeah.
simple as you think they are. They're not as politically conservative as you think they are. Actually, in a lot of cases, it's just
Yeah.
the conception you get is sort of the loudest voices, the weirdest voices, the most
Sure.
fringe voices, and the average evangelicals. So I kind of call myself the evangelical whisperer in some ways.
Yeah, yeah. I always think somehow that, this is one reason that when someone like J.D. Vance writes a book on growing up in poverty and it's all about Rust Belt and economic deprivation, they love that because that's their world. The New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, it doesn't matter whether the right and left, but what they're comfortable with is that sort of material. When it gets into the religious presuppositions that actually drive these movements, their eyes glaze over.
Oh, you unless the thing is, if you look at some of the best religion reporters in America today, most of them grew up evangelical. Um,
Exactly.
and I think there's a very good reason for that because you can't understand evangelicalism as an outsider. You can't
No.
understand religion as an outsider. Like
Yeah.
you can understand it, but not get it. Like understand the nuance and the
Right.
in all the little vagaries that happen with religion. And I think that's the problem is that the media elites tend to be elites. Like
Yeah.
they come from certain backgrounds where it's like, oh, my parents were or my grandparents were Episcopalian in the 1940s, and that's
Yeah.
the last connection to religion my family has. It's like you don't understand religion, and so like part of what I do a lot of is just try to balance out coverage. Like
Yeah.
the media will come to me with a story like, oh, I want to write a story about X, and I'm like, I don't think that's a great way to think about that problem or that
Yeah.
issue, or I don't think that's I will say, can I help you kind of like guide you towards what I think is a better story, like a
Yeah.
more
Yeah.
accurate, more interesting story? Because
And that might represent the people you're talking about a little more clearly than, hey, I've got to pretend this is a podcast and forget that we're just talking here.
got
I'm
it.
so into what we're talking about. We'll get back to this. This is In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer, and I'm Frank Schaeffer, and my guest today is Ryan P. Burge. Ryan is an associate professor of political science at Eastern Illinois University. And Ryan is a very interesting person who I've kind of followed. I read his book and on the nuns, Nones, people who don't subscribe to religion, that I guess came out about a year ago. And helped coin the term that everybody then went on and merrily used, sometimes talking about you, sometimes not. He's written for the New York Times, for Politico, and the Wall Street Journal, and authored over 30 peer-reviewed articles uh, and book chapters. What we're going to talk about today started when I read an article by you, Ryan, and I got a link from my producer, Ernie, this morning, which linked not to the original article, which I can no longer find because it was a while back, on the issue that then was covered in the press because you wrote about it, of the fact that there was there's sort of an emergence of more young men joining churches than there are young women, which is kind of the opposite scenario to what you see in colleges, where the young women are going to college and the young men aren't. When I read that, it reminded me how important your work on the nuns was. And I know you have a new book coming out in March too that we'll talk about in a minute. But let's unpack that for a minute, because I think of all the stories that you have been following and are the most expert on of anybody I've read, because you've done the work and you understand the inside of this. Let's talk about this, that younger men seem to be more interested in religion as either new converts or returning than younger women. First of all, the political and social implications. But before we even get into that stuff, what are the philosophical and religious implications in terms of what does this say about these younger men and the moment we're in? And that's a broad enough question. And knowing, having read, rather than retelling people watching what you wrote, you're sitting here, tell us.
Yeah, so it's something I saw a couple years ago in the data, and I've written about it several times in several different spots. It's just funny how sort of what bubbles up in the media ecosystem, because like I throw all these ideas out all the time, and I
Yeah.
think some of them are really good and some of them aren't so good.
Mm-hmm.
And this is one that took a while to sort of percolate up to the New York Times. Ruth Graham picked it up from the
Yes.
New York Times. She's a tremendous religion reporter.
And did she quote you? Because Ruth
Yeah.
sometimes emails me and asks questions like, who do I talk to about such and such? And I don't think I ever gave her your name. I'd like to take credit for it, but I don't think I did. But I know who
Uh,
she is. By the
no,
way,
no,
nothing to do
she
with Billy
did.
Graham. Yeah.
Yeah, she did. She did. And I've built relationships with reporters, over a long period of time. I've been doing this for, 8 years in the public sphere.
Yeah.
So, um, and Ruth, I emailed actually a little behind the scenes stuff. I emailed Ruth a post that I was going to post yesterday on my Substack. And I go, you interested in this and all? She goes, yeah, I am. My editor's really interested. I want to write about this. So can you hold the post? So I'm actually like seeding ideas with her about something else.
That's
But
important, by the way. And thank you for doing that. And watching what Ruth has been writing, I feel your presence in the background.
well, I mean, part of the thing is I want people to get it right. Period. Like that's my goal in life is just like I don't care who wins. I just want it to be right. I
Yeah.
want the data to accurately reflect reality. I want people, and if it's the media, it's academics, it's the general public. I just want you to understand the world. That's it. And media helps me do that. Like that
Hey,
gets me.
we're going to get back into this, but I'm going to interrupt you because there's something before I forget. Being
Yeah.
72 years old, I have to interrupt myself. Otherwise, I forget the
Go ahead.
question.
Yeah.
I'm being serious about that. How has the fact that Trump's been reelected, just the first election, suddenly got all these people calling me and saying, explain these evangelicals to me that I had not heard of, like they'd lost interest in that.
Yeah.
And then they got interested again in 2015 and 16.
Yeah.
Now they're all interested again. And I'm just curious about your contacts with the media in terms of them now coming to you saying, who are these guys and how does that fit in with Opus Dei and what's going on with the Heritage Foundation and
Uh-huh.
who's an evangelical on the Supreme Court and is Trump going to listen to these people? All of a sudden, they're all over it again.
From my perspective, I'm not getting. I got asked the question, why did evangelicals vote for Trump about 700 times
Yes.
around 2016, and even
Yeah.
I did 60 Minutes with Anderson Cooper,
Yeah.
and he asked me that same question probably 4 times in an hour, just in a
Yes.
slightly different way.
Yeah.
I haven't been asked that. I think the media is sort of tired. Okay, so a couple things. I think the media is tired of Trump. Like
Yeah.
it's been what, we're 9 years on now that he's been
Yeah.
in the public mind. I mean, come on, no one can sustain that. The other thing though is that I think that the media is like, how many more stories can we write about evangelicals loving Donald Trump? Like
Yeah.
it's
Right. Right.
at this point, it's like you're saying the same thing, just a slightly different version of the same thing.
Yes.
I mean, there's angles you can talk about. The abortion angle, for instance, is interesting. But what I do think is really interesting, and I think you're seeing this in the cultural zeitgeist, you actually saw it today.
Yeah.
Facebook came out, Mark Zuckerberg came out and said they're going to stop moderating content
Yeah. I
on
saw that.
Facebook. And basically that's a capitulation to the right, saying that like the kind of content that we moderated tended to hurt the right-wing views much more than they hurt the left-wing views.
Right.
We're going to move our content moderation team from California to Texas. as sort of a visual representation of the fact we're going to a part of the country that's seen as more politically right wing or neutral. Definitely not
Yeah.
California.
Yeah.
I think the to go back to the first question about men and women and religion. I think that there's been a move in America. The culture has shifted to the right on social issues over the last
Hmm.
3 or 4 years.
Yeah.
Things like transgender.
Yeah.
We're even seeing it in same sex marriage now. We're seeing a reversal of opinion on same sex marriage among a subset of Americans,
Yeah.
especially white Christians. So the
And I
DEI.
think from what I've read from you and others, amongst the subset of young white Christian, or maybe not even white, young males who are starting to become more religious, they're not going to their local Episcopalian or,
Mm-mm.
church. If they're going to a Baptist church, it's a Southern Baptist church, not your kind of Baptist.
And even non-denominational, which are by and large evangelical, kind of Southern Baptists, and they're seeing I've seen a lot of stories about the Orthodox Church, Greek Orthodox,
Yes.
Russian Orthodox, an
Yeah.
influx of men, which by the way I think is happening, but it's not that many. Like we're
No.
talking, 20, 30,000, which is not nothing, but like in the grand scheme of America, that's a rounding error. But I
Yeah.
think you are seeing, and here's how I describe it to people: like, why is this happening? Why are men coming back to religion?
Mm.
I think for a lot of them, like the culture moved very quickly on certain issues in a
Mm.
way that was uncomfortable for a lot of white men. Okay,
Yeah.
like DEI was an example of like white men took that as an attack upon them for their
Yeah.
gender and their race.
Yeah.
Rightly or wrongly, you can, tell them to virtue signal all they want. At the end of the day, a lot of white men feel like everyone's looking out for women, people of color, and not me.
Yeah.
So who perpetuated that? The
Mm.
Democrats did. The liberals did.
Yeah.
Um, on same-sex marriage, I think a lot of men have moved from I think it's gross to I'll live with it, and then the trans thing happened, and they saw drag queen story hour, and we're like, wait a minute here. I
Yeah.
was cool with the gay stuff. I moved. And by the way, think about this. Ellen DeGeneres came out as gay on her television program 25 years ago.
Yeah.
That
Yeah.
that's how long that took for us to accept same-sex marriage. The trans thing seemed like it dropped on us what, 5 years ago,
Right.
7 years ago. So I think the culture moved very quickly, and now we're seeing young men, young white men especially, look for reasons why they're uncomfortable with things like transgender, and
Yeah.
they're saying, okay, I can't just say I'm a transphobe because that makes me look like a transphobe.
Yeah. Yeah.
So what's a justification? Well, the Bible says in his image, he created male and female. Now I've got a foundation, a
Thing.
firm
Yeah.
foundation for my belief system. So they're almost taking politics first and then backing into religion from the
Hmm.
political lens.
A few weeks ago, Ernie and I on our podcast had a very interesting woman, a professor who teaches at the university in Rome and lives in Florence, and who's written a book on the correlation between the culture wars in America and the justifications Vladimir Putin uses for his war in Ukraine. In fact, all his aggression, and how it's backed by Archbishop Kirill of the Russian Orthodox Church. And I learned some very interesting things from her book that I didn't know that actually you'll be interested in. And when we're done, Ernie, don't get off the phone. I mean, don't get off the show. Stay with Ernie and talk to him, and we'll give you the name of her book and her name.
Great.
Um, but the work she's done, and she's an academic such as yourself. I mean, it's very, very documented and good. Really surprised me because I've known people like Dr. Dobson of Focus on the Family from back in the day when I knew him. Um, he was having meetings with Russian Orthodox bishops in the 1990s, not like yesterday, laying
Mhm.
the groundwork for what actually happened. And what she's showing is that the history of the Orthodox Church does not lend itself very well to American culture war um, litmus tests, but now it does because they have seen the usefulness of it. So that's a long preamble to asking you if you see any correlation with the fact that we've got this sort of movement, I guess you could say, to the right, or at least to religion in America. And of course, it's not isolated because this is happening in Hungary with Orban. This is
Mhm.
happening in Austria. This is happening in France. And above all, in Russia, and Vladimir Putin is a hero to some of these people, including Tucker Carlson and some others who say they're speaking for conservatives. I just think what you're doing is so interesting because it's not only interesting locally in the sense of America, but when you fold in Hindu nationalism or the Saudi royal family or all these other people, we've got a worldwide phenomena of a pushback against all liberal democratic values, certainly, the trans issues and so forth are part of that. But it's a bigger push than that, and it's certainly bigger than Donald Trump.
Hmm. That's it. I think that's the key is Donald Trump is not, he's not the one who caused all these things to be. He sort of rode the wave that was emerging in America, which is like discontent. I think
Yeah,
if like we look back on this period of American life, even like I went to college in 2000 to 2004, and there's a movie we watched a lot in college called Fight Club.
yeah, which I like, by the way. It's a good movie.
And you know what it's really about? It's about a lot of guys getting to a point in life. They're like, I've got the money, I've got the job, I've got everything I
Sure.
want in life, and life sucks. Like it has
Yeah,
no meaning and how it has no purpose.
yeah,
And so what makes me feel alive is getting in a fist fight with somebody
yeah,
because it's visceral. It's like old
yeah.
school, like man stuff. You know what I mean? Like it's, and I think that we're riding that wave still. You know,
Well,
like
I felt when I saw that movie, and I have no way to prove this, but I remember saying at the time that this film has a feel of a prophetic thing about it. A lot of kind of science fiction doesn't,
mhm,
but two movies actually stick in my mind that do, to go off at a tangent here. Fight Club, with Fincher's movie Fight Club,
mhm.
and of course Blade Runner,
Yeah.
because when you put those two films together, nothing after that that's happened should surprise us.
That's and I think we're riding the wave of that ennui, right?
Yeah,
That like I just don't feel like, and I think the problem though is that was for the white upper class. Like Fight
yeah,
Club is about like people who have money. Think about
right.
the guy who worked in a factory because now he can't even have the money that his parents had and his grandparents had
Yeah,
because his job's been globalized, right? It's been sent to
yeah.
China or Vietnam or Laos or Cambodia, and they're doing the job for a tenth the price and they're working 80 hours a week. And
Yeah,
so now
Fight Club, by the way, Ernie just sent me a note. Says, just remind both of you guys that it was written by a gay man, by the way. He sent me a note.
that's a good point. I mean, that's a very like feeling like you don't fit. Like
Yeah,
even go back. Like my oldest son's named Holden, and he was named after Holden Caulfield and Catcher in the Rye. Right,
sure.
the feeling of like disaffection, like you don't
Yeah,
fit in with the society around you.
yeah,
I think we've moved to the point where post-materialist in America in a lot of ways, or post-capitalist.
yeah,
Like, and now it's like we're searching for meaning. And how do
yeah.
we make meaning in this world? And as religion has faded, the structure of plausibility structures and meaning structures have gone, and we don't
Hmm.
have like the working hard and getting ahead. We've gotten ahead, we've done well, and
Right.
now what's on the other side? I think that's leading to a lot of people like like we're even seeing guys like Richard Dawkins say, "I'm a cultural Christian now."
Yeah,
I think that's probably people trying to find something to ground themselves in
yeah,
that
yeah.
had existed for thousands of years.
Well, and you see some of that in reflections when you read pieces in the Wall Street Journal, as I do every day, in the same way people ask you, how could these Christians say they're moral and vote for Trump? And that's old now. But a similar question saying, but all the statistics in the stock market and the economy and employment and wages, everything's up, everything's wonderful, everything's perfect. Why are people still so dissatisfied? Why do polls show that they feel the economy's weak when we're the strongest and most resilient economy in the world, bar
Mm-hmm.
none. This is where everybody wants to be.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody pours their money into investment here. Even con things like Bitcoin take off in America, like anything it touches turns to gold. And you guys are complaining,
Yeah.
and it takes 5 years to get a dentist appointment in the UK, and here and so forth and so on. This is a recurrent theme. Let me reintroduce you a second here.
Yeah.
I'm in conversation with my guest today is Ryan P. Burge. And Ryan, before I go any further, do you happen to have a copy of your book there? Because I read
I
it
don't.
in,
I don't.
um,
It's in the it's on my office in the first floor. My kids are yelling at each other because they don't have school today because it
good.
snowed. So
Well,
they're
I,
home.
I I read it in Kindle, and I have quotes from it I want to talk to you about. But I also want to, before we go any further, and I reintroduce you, just tell me about the book that's coming out in March.
Yeah. So there's a book in March for Oxford University Press
Yeah,
called The American Religious Landscape: Facts, Trends, and the Future. It's a textbook basically. Like
yeah,
it's about 300 pages, and there's one chapter on evangelicals, there's one chapter on Muslims, there's one chapter on Jews, there's one chapter on atheists
yeah,
and agnostics. And so the chapters are basically like 10 or 12 graphs, very data driven, not a lot of theorizing. Like I'm just trying to describe, it's a very descriptive book
yeah.
about the way the religious world of America looks like.
Well,
Because
make
when I
sure
was
you get a copy to Ernie. Get the publisher to send him a
I can do
file
that.
so I can look at it. And let's get you back. We're a year late on this book on nuns.
That's all right.
Let's get right. Let's be the first person to interview you on your new book when it gets out.
Yeah, in
So
March. So that's, I mean, that book's the thing is, it's Oxford. So I wrote it for my academic career. But
yeah,
here's what's nice is Oxford said we'll sell it for 24.95.
that's a steal for an academic book.
Yeah. So it's softback. It's not one of those books that like the libraries
No,
buy.
I
Like,
understand. Yeah,
like they want it to be mass market, and I want it to be mass market. I think it's great for students
yeah,
because when I was teaching, it was like, how come I can't find a like just a good description of what like evangelicals look like in terms of age and race and gender and
yeah,
all those. So that was my thing is like whenever I teach and I go, why is there not something with that material that I want? I just make
yeah,
it and then
yeah.
sell it. Like so that's my whole goal is
That's
to
what you do. Yeah.
fill the gaps in the curriculum because there's huge gaps right now.
So let me run my little plug here. This is In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer. Please subscribe right now on YouTube where you're listening live, or when you rewatch this on YouTube to In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer. Also on Apple Podcasts, and to my Substack commentary page, it has to be said, at frankschaeffer.substack.com. That will help us. Please do that. And also the book Nuns. Let's just go back to that. I think that's a tremendous book, because you identified something and backed it up that people weren't talking about at the time. Was and this is like a wrinkle in your book that I want to get into, and in your other writing, and thinking about this, and that is that, of course, to declare yourself a nun, None, is not to say that you're necessarily an atheist or an agnostic, because when you look at other statistics, which you've also cited in places, it's not that it's more what G.K. Chesterton said. I think he said it, or maybe it was someone else, that, if you don't believe in God, it's not that you're believing in nothing, because we've got more spirituality
Mm-hmm.
in the air and less science-based, fact-based stuff, which I think is also a window into why all the conspiracism takes off so easily in this time frame,
Mm-hmm.
because a lot of people are wandering around. So two things: does that fit in with why younger men are joining more stable religious groups? And also, what is the general kind of direction that you think we're headed in from your studies, in
Mm-hmm.
terms of more religious, less religious? Are women going to start going back to church too? Is
Mm-hmm.
this the beginning of what evangelicals always hope for, which is some sort of quote unquote revival, reformation? What is this?
Yeah. So one of the biggest religion stories from last year was I wrote a post about this. The nuns have hit a ceiling.
Yeah,
And the rise of the nuns was basically went unabated from 1991 to 2020 or so.
I
I mean,
saw that post, by the way, and it
yeah.
got my attention because I didn't know that would happen. I just thought, just like when in the 1970s, I would have thought by now we're going to be totally secular. It's Jane Fonda and the Clintons all the way down. You know what
Yeah,
I'm
but
saying?
it's not though. Like we've actually
No,
seen, I mean, the line goes up, and then the last 3 or 4 years of data from multiple data sources, by the way, not just one, from 3 or 4 different data sources, all point to the conclusion that the nuns have sort of flatlined around 30% of America. And there's actually
right.
some data that says that millennials have become slightly more religious in the last couple of years, and
Yeah,
Gen Z has become significantly more religious in the last couple of years. So I think when we look back at American history, like American religious history, the
yeah,
1990 to 2020 period is going to be a discrete event in
yes,
where rapid secularization took hold. Now, let me be clear about this point, though. I don't think that we're going to have a religious revival like the first or
no,
second Great Awakening. Like, let's be clear
yeah.
about that. What I think we're seeing is a pause and a slowdown in the trajectory of the rise of secularization, right? So,
Also, something you point out that's so interesting is it's also broken a generational stereotype where it's old white guys my age who are, quote, still conservative or still religious,
mhm,
in the same way that Trump just broke the racial and cultural stereotype by getting a significant number of Black young men and Black women, as
mhm,
well as Hispanic younger men and women, voting
yep,
for him. Like, what's that? What is it that's happening where everything that a 72-year-old like me thought was cast in concrete and permanent
yeah.
is going away? And I read stuff by you that it's like, how can this be happening? I have to rethink everything I think.
The counties. I have a piece that's coming out next week about what can we learn about the 2024 election before the survey data is out, because we don't have the survey data yet. It's like it's going to
Right,
come out in March or April.
right.
So here's what I know: if you look at the counties that move the furthest toward Trump between 2020 and 2024, the one commonality they have is they're overwhelmingly Hispanic,
Yeah,
especially in South Texas, like the Rio Grande Valley. I mean, and they're Catholic. They're Catholic and Hispanic. That's the combination where Trump
Sure.
did the absolute best. We're seeing an electoral realignment right now,
What
I think.
about Pentecostal and
Ooh, yeah.
Hispanic?
So Pentecostalism. So interesting thing about Trump is Trump really leaned into the Pentecostal wing of American evangelicalism
Sure.
in a way that no other
Well,
politician has
like
done.
Paula White and all that stuff.
Exactly right. Like George W. Bush was an evangelical, but not that kind of
He had
evangelical.
never heard of those guys. He wouldn't know what they
No.
were doing.
Like, and the thing is, and this is like to go back to our first conversation about how to like to explain evangelicalism to reporters,
Yeah,
they don't understand how fractured evangelicalism is now, right?
sure.
There's like you got your Joel Osteen, and he lives in his own world by himself, and no one talks to him in the evangelical world, but he has 10 million people who follow him on Twitter, right?
Yeah,
Kind of prosperity gospel, but kind of whatever. Then you got your Paula White Pentecostals over here. You got your old school Southern Baptist over there. You got your new hip non-denoms over there. There's not one person that speaks for
no,
evangelicalism anymore. Not that there ever was. Billy Graham was certainly, or Jerry Falwell or Pat
yeah,
Robertson were definitely like figureheads. There's not one person you could pick that
sure.
50% of evangelicals say, yeah, that's our guy or our woman.
Yeah.
It just doesn't, because we're so, and Trump leaned into that Pentecostal flavor. And I think he's won over some black Pentecostals and some Hispanic Pentecostals. If you think about it, people ask you what kind of religion's growing in America, the one word I can say is charismatic.
Yeah, absolutely.
Charismatic religion is growing. Non-denoms, almost all of them are charismatic in their worship. Now, about the hand raising, the tongue thing, at least the hand raising, some of them do tongue, some of them don't, but they all have charismatic worship.
Yeah,
It's not
absolutely.
hymns. It's
Well,
not,
and they also believe in prophecy and prophets. So
yes,
if someone
correct.
stands up and says, "I had a dream and the Lord showed me this," and
Mm-hmm.
this, there's a willing audience out there of people who are ready to believe it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think Trump, but that works for Trump though, because Trump's like a kind of we talk about Steve Jobs. He had a reality distortion force field around the iPhone.
Sure.
He was like, "You're going to make an iPhone." They're like, "We can't." They go, "Yes, you will," and he
Yeah,
did. Like he basically forced people to go where they didn't want to go.
sure.
Pentecostalism kind of has that in some ways, right? It's like you're
Yeah,
going to do what God called you to do, whether you want to or not. And
yeah.
I think he likes that whole prosperity angle, the idea that like there's a higher calling out there, that he's almost like ordained by God to be the president. I think all that plays into who Trump is. And by the
Well,
way,
also the idea that anything that anybody says bad about me is fake news. And of course, this is what I got with my mother's milk in terms of, well, the Bible says this. It doesn't matter what your biology teacher's telling you. That's, fake information. And in fact, it's even worse. And
mhm.
this is where they've gone. It's demonic.
Yeah, that's exactly that's
It's
the difference,
demonic.
though.
This is a demonic attack.
That's the difference. It used to be like different was different, but now different is evil. I think
Yeah,
that's the clear difference that we have in American discourse now is like, it used to be like Tip O'Neill would play golf with Ronald Reagan.
sure, sure.
Like they were friends. They fought like cats and dogs on policy, but
Yeah.
now it's like not only do I not think you're wrong, I think you're wrong on policy. I think you're a terrible human being.
Yeah.
And I think
And
that's a
then you
different
mix
level.
some conspiratorial lies into that, outright QAnon type lies, where the Democratic Party is a cult of pedophiles, meeting in secret to groom children or something. In other words, even some of the you might say not Pentecostal exactly, but the kind of believe anything conspiracism is also zeroing in on what you might call the fringe moral issues. It's about pedophilia, or it's about this, or and that fits into the sort of medical involvement with trans community. It's very sexually fundamentalist in the sense that it's very dominated by people who either have a very misogynist view of women and or a certain view of gay people or trans people. But the litmus test, if you drill down a little bit, in most cases has some relationship to what would have been preached from fundamentalist pulpits in the 70s in terms of America's going to hell, we've got to stop this. I mean, there's a connection. These movements aren't separate things, I think.
But think about this though. Pentecostals and Southern Baptists are both very conservative, but
Yeah,
Pentecostals ordain women
yeah.
and Southern Baptists have gone the other way as hard as they can to not ordain women.
as
So
have as have Catholics
as
in
have
terms of
Catholics.
pushback ever since the Vatican II.
But the only large denomination in America that's still growing, the Assemblies of God.
Yeah,
So, when people say like the thing I hear a lot, Frank, and you probably hear this too, is liberal religion dies, conservative religion grows.
hmm.
And I say, okay, liberal religion has died. Like Episcopalians, United Methodists, they're all on a significant decline. But the Southern Baptist Convention had 16.2 million members in 2006. Now it has 12.9 million members
Yeah.
today, losing a quarter million a year, while the Assemblies of God is now larger than it was 20 years ago.
I know this
So,
is a very footnote of a footnotey question, but we had we were talking a little while ago. I'm just scanning my books here. Krista Brown's book, Baptist Land, on how the cover-ups in the Southern Baptist denomination, where they not only wouldn't listen to women, they blamed women for being molested, then would move pastors around to save their butt, which is nothing unusual. The Catholics did it too,
oh yeah,
etc.
oh yeah.
But I wonder if that has something to do with the decline in the Baptist denomination as well. And then here's my question to you. From what you are getting out there with your ear to the ground, how does that compare to the charismatic denominations, either independent churches or the denominations themselves? They all screw up too and have affairs, but are women treated, the ordination of women is going ahead in some of these places.
Mm-hmm.
Has that changed the power structure in terms of the dynamic where women feel aggrieved for some reason
Mm-hmm.
or put upon, report this and it's brushed over?
Mm-hmm.
Is that happening in these Pentecostal / charismatic churches as well, like it did in the Southern Baptists, which I think has been ruinous to the Southern Baptists?
So the biggest story in the last 30 years is the rise of the nuns. The
Yeah,
second biggest story is the rise of the nons, which are non-denominational Protestant Christians.
yeah,
They were 3% of America in 1972. They're 15% of America today. There's actually more evangelical non-denominationals than evangelical Southern Baptists now.
sure.
Um, and here's the thing about non-denoms. Here's why they're winning. Because America has become very anti-institutional over the last
Yes,
20 or 30 years. We hate
yeah.
institutions, whether it be banks or big business or unions or the media or churches.
Or
And
health insurance
or,
companies.
exactly right. And I think like the SBC, their biggest problem is they're not they're conservative or liberal or whatever. It's because
Right.
they're a denomination. Like they're
Yeah,
an institution. They're the largest evangelical institution in America, and we
yeah.
hate institutions. So how do non-denoms thrive? Because we are anti-institutional. When
Yeah,
you
which, by the way, is a final outworking of Martin Luther and the idea that, the Bible alone in your own conscience, and here I stand. And it's taken 500 years to actually come to full fruition, and it's
yes,
doing it now.
but
Because in the end, why is there anything called the church anyway? Capital
Mhm.
T, capital C.
You don't need it, right?
You don't
But
need
here's
it.
but here's the end result of that though. At least with a denomination, you have leadership structure and legal structure and oversight structures,
Sure.
right? So if there is something happening with a pastor in a local church, you have someone to call and say, "I think there's sexual abuse going on here. I think there's
Yeah, who are you
corruption. I
going to
think."
call if Pastor Billy Bob with 10,000 members in south of Los Angeles, somewhere in the middle of whatever,
Mm-hmm.
now he's diddling the kid behind the pulpit. What are you
And
going to do
he's
about
the
it?
and he's the boss though. He's the
Well, not only
authority.
that, he's the multi-million-dollar center of all the giving and the thing and the 20 youth pastors and the whole machine and the daycare center and the thing and the parking garage they're building for profit across the street. I mean, these are small empires.
And that's the problem is there is no one to call. There's no one up the
Right.
chain to bring in the adult in the room to say, "Hey, hold on. I don't care who you are and who you
Right.
are. Let's get to the bottom of this problem. And if you did do what they say you did, then you're out." You
Yeah.
can't do that in a non-denominational church. So what I think is going to happen is the scandals we saw at the Catholic Church and then the SBC, they're happening right now in non-denominational churches. They just don't make national news because they're not a national problem because these aren't
Sure.
national denominations. So it's not like the abuse is going to go away. I think it's actually going to be covered up more because of the fragmented nature of what Protestant Christianity has become.
Yeah. Yeah. And out of that comes another question, and that is, okay, so these folks had a lot to do with Trump's reelection, but in a way, he's the footnote because you have this worldwide phenomena of, quote, going back or whatever to something, whether it's Hungary or Hindu nationalism, whatever it is. So just to fast forward a little bit, looking at the Democratic Party, and I'm just asking for your opinion here. Looking at the Democratic Party and what you might call the liberal democratic movement in America, my observation, there's two things about it. I think liberals have become very good at annoying people with culture war issues to the point of, as the British say, sobs, to the point of sobs. Where it's just like I look around at the liberal movement and I say, well, with friends like this, I do not need enemies. Just tell me one more time to put he, him after my name.
Or
And
use the term, Frank, pregnant person or
pregnant
person
person,
or birthing person.
birthing person, or person with a vagina, and basically
Or Latinx, by the way, Frank.
Right, or
Latinx.
Latinx. And then look at the big liberal institutions like the ACLU and Planned Parenthood that have been completely taken over by people who say these things.
Ooh, Southern Poverty Law Center, Frank. I am not a
Yeah,
big fan of them anymore. They call everyone a terrorist organization or extremist group.
right.
Even like evangelical groups that listen are far out of the mainstream, but I would in no way say they're inciting violence or hatred towards. They're
Exactly.
they're just saying that we think marriage is between one man and one woman. That is not violence, man. Like
Right.
that's stating a biblical position that they've
Well,
held
not only
for.
that, that's stating a 99% of the whole human race right now position. In other words, if you're, talk about, cultural domination and colonialism, for a white liberal to basically pronounce that every part of the human race that doesn't agree with these three things about gender are terrorists or something, they're not just alienating American conservatives, they are setting up Vladimir Putin for victory across the globe when he says we don't go for that. And
Mhm.
so forth and so on. So my question to you, because you're a keen observer of all this stuff from our side, as it were, because I consider myself a liberal progressive, what inherently is it about the movement of which I am a part, put it that way, that has annoyed so much of America to sobs that we're not going to win it, that Donald Trump, who the right that votes for him acknowledges is a bad person and a con artist, nevertheless votes for him just to stick it to people like me
Mhm.
because they feel like they've had it stuck to them for
Mhm.
50 years.
Mhm.
Now, the left always talks about how the right trolls the left. What the left doesn't ever want to talk about is how how we have trolled the right for 50 years as if somehow they're just supposed to go along with this. And then, of course, the media that we talked about earlier are busy discussing the Rust Belt and Appalachia and the economic changes that globalization called, and they don't want to touch this with a 10-foot pole either.
Mhm.
I just want how you think this all shakes out, where you think that's going to go, and
Let me give you a meta analysis, Frank, as
yeah,
best. Okay. The key word here is globalization. I think that's the thing, right? It starts in the 1970s where American manufacturers realized that they can make crap outside the United States for a lot cheaper and a lot better.
yeah,
China joins the WTO in about 2000, right? So we normalized relationships with China because that's what you have to do in WTO. So now China has spent decades building infrastructure to make it easier to manufacture stuff at
mm-hmm.
scale and very well, by the way. Chinese stuff is not crap. We can't make
No.
that stuff in America. It's actually very good.
Well, I remember back in the days with made in Japan was an insult. It'd be like, some cheap little thing you stick in a drink, a cocktail, a little
Mm-hmm.
umbrella. And then it went from that to like, hey, I'd rather have a Subaru.
You don't listen. You don't want an iPhone made in America. You want it made in Foxconn and the factories in China. It's way better because they're
Right.
just better at it. So here's what happened. A lot of people started losing their jobs in America. People with high school diplomas working in places like I live right now in rural America, okay,
Right.
where the big employers are factories. And so for a while there, they could kind of put up with it because it was only some people losing their job. And then it was more people losing their job. And then the Great Recession hits and things start taking a turn for a lot of these people. And then what happens is Biden takes office and inflation goes crazy, goes up to 9%. And guess who's hurt worse by that than anybody else? People at the lower end of the socioeconomic spectrum. So they're
Yeah.
looking for someone to blame for they're not getting ahead like their parents and grandparents did. So here's what Trump did. Here's his brilliance. Two things converged at one time. Inflation went sky high, higher than it's been in a long, long time. And people were jumping over the southern border, and there was video of that on every news station
Sure.
every night.
Yeah.
So, guess what the average person in America thought, rightly, by the way, which is I can't afford to buy milk and eggs. And Joe Biden is letting people from God knows where jump over the southern border unabated and done. And by the way, he didn't do anything about that
Right.
until late in his term. Like, why was that not a day one priority for Joe Biden? I do
Hmm.
not understand immigration. If you're a blue collar worker in America, you do not like immigrants, period. End of
Yeah.
discussion. Because even if they do or not, the data is not clear on this. Even if they don't take your job, you still think they take your job and you
Sure.
don't like it.
Yeah.
And the problem is Bernie tried to, Bernie and Elizabeth Warren and people like that tried to blame the rich people, Jeff Bezos and
AOC.
yeah, yeah, they tried to blame, and guess what? That message just does not land for whatever. I don't know why, but it does not land. The immigrant
Well,
message,
maybe because Americans are aspirational. You might be the next rich guy. That's the hope.
exactly right.
It's not just aspirational. That's the religion.
It is. And that's the American dream, though, right? Like
Yeah,
Jeff
yeah,
Bezos made himself rich. Bill Gates made himself rich. Mark
yeah,
Zuckerberg made himself rich, right? You can be mad all you want. Those guys they're the American dream.
yeah,
So, we can talk about raising their taxes and stuff, but no one gets excited about tax rates. You know what
yeah,
they get excited about? Deport all illegal immigrants. That's what they
yeah,
get excited about. And I think the left has assumed that people are better than what they are. They have more
yeah.
virtue than what they are.
I think that's a good point, by the way.
I mean,
Say that again. The leftists assume people are better than they
they
are.
assume that people are better than what they are. They assume, and I'll give you an example from academia. Okay, this is a great example. I was talking to a guy who's on the job market right now. He's a white guy. He goes, "I can't get a job because I'm a white guy," which, by the way, is probably true. That's not just
Yeah,
like right wing talking points. And he
yeah,
goes, "Here's the thing. Am I glad that academia is getting more diverse, more gender diverse, more racial? I am because I
yeah,
understand it was too white. But am I happy that I don't get the job that I wanted because they're hiring women or people of color? I'm not going to applaud that."
yeah,
You can't expect a guy like that to be like, oh, thank God that black woman got that job and I didn't. That's just fantastic. Like,
yeah,
what do you expect from people? They're not as good as you think they are. At the end of
yeah,
the day, you know what they want to do? They want to get a good job. They want to take care of their family. They want to build America. They want to build their community. And if you're getting in the way of that, they're not going to be happy about it. No matter how much they see the value in diversity, it
yeah.
does not change their current reality.
I want to jump into a subject that I think is very related to this. Go back to something I was saying before in terms of some of the culture war stuff that Trump used and so on and so forth. And this idea of liberal elites annoying Americans to sobs, whether it's about what you're talking about in terms of jobs and equity and inclusion stuff. But on the other side of this, I think that there's the whole issue that I think also is like you're saying, don't expect people to be better than they are. We're all
Mm-hmm.
self-interested. Here's something I would throw out for consideration by my liberal friends. Don't expect anybody to be thrilled when you look at the whole evolutionary process of gender, sex differences, cohabitation, marriage, procreation, biology, and say, we're going to change everything. And you're a bigot if you don't agree. And by the way, this may not sound very scientific, but we have a new set of facts for you, such as, gender is assigned at birth. And your ordinary semi-educated person looks at this and says, well, that's never what I was told. But whether it's true or not, it's really unsettling.
That's the problem is
And the genius of the left has been to throw all the pickup sticks up into the air again and again and again and see where they fall on the table. And at a certain point, everybody just says, excuse me, but hey, fuck this, I'm done.
can we breathe a little bit? That's what I want to
Yeah,
say. Like,
I'm really, as someone said, sort of about these issues, enough. Let me catch
enough.
my breath. And then, of course, it's an unfortunate fact of history that at the same time as we were doing all this other stuff, and it's not just gender, it's everything. Here you've got a 12-year-old who's handed an iPhone, and 4 years later, you realize somehow you're losing your child to this technology.
Mm-hmm.
And so the billionaires, if they're hated, it isn't because they're not paying taxes. It's because they've taken away the parental control on the ground of parents from children. And I'm not just talking about the moral R-rated stuff or what you think about porn online. I'm talking about time spent, attention spans, who's sitting in the car looking at their phone instead of talking to their mother. When you add all that shit up, of course, everybody's going back to church and trying to find God again. Because, hey, man, let's get back to basics here. This
Doesn't it
shit's
feel like
not working.
post-modernity went too far?
Yeah,
Like this is Derrida's like love child, right? Like this is
yeah,
where we get, man, when like there's no truth and there's no good and there's no objectively right and wrong.
yeah,
It's like we're redefining everything. We
yeah,
redefine marriage,
yeah,
okay, but now we're redefining gender.
yeah,
Like at some point, it's like you've got to have a firm foundation to rest upon, and if you don't, like you're in an existential crisis. And I think that the left is in an existential crisis right
yeah.
now because they have no orthodoxy.
Well, and you look at these polls that the New York Times and people have printed, and I can't give you the source, but you'll know it because you're this statistical analysis person of, liberals are much more unhappy than conservatives when it comes to all these things. Well, of course they are,
Yeah.
because basically you're out there floating around, unable to, name the gender of your child because maybe they haven't decided yet. And then on the other hand, when it comes to international affairs, God forbid you draw any correlation between, the history of Islam invading every country they've ever, quote, evangelized, and modern terrorism, because then you're an Islamophobe.
Mhm.
Touch any point you want to even discuss these things with the left makes you a bad person. You're just not supposed to say anything,
You're a bigot.
which explains the whole rise of the right in Britain and France, for instance.
Hmm.
Very much the same. They're all demonized as homophobic, anti-Semites, whatever it may be. A
Hmm.
lot of them are just, what you would call ordinary people who are your neighbors,
Yeah.
who were just saying, well, I just happen to notice that anytime somebody drives a truck into a crowd in Marseille, it's another bearded guy screaming, God is
Allah
great.
Akbar.
And I'm
Yeah.
done.
Hmm.
I'm done. I don't care, what you call me.
Yeah.
And
It's
I just don't think the American left gets it. They
no.
don't get that instability is the enemy of winning elections on
The,
all fronts.
the activist left has done more damage to the Democratic Party than any other subsegment. It's like the people who like write for the New York Times like drive the opinions of the Biden administration. It's like
Right.
go talk to a farmer who lives in rural Illinois about how
Right.
he feels about these issues, please. Like,
Yeah.
and the thing is, here's what I know. I look at data a lot. Americans aren't bigots. They're
Yeah.
not racists. But when you call anyone who uses, like I'm a man as a bigot, or
Yeah.
like I don't like DEI as a racist,
Or you didn't put he, him after your name.
that does not make you a bigot, nor a racist, nor a xenophobe, nor a transphobe. It makes you a human being. And I think the problem is it's like there's a growing number of people who say, here's what I am, and you better accept it. And if not, you're leading to this. This is what kills me. The trans movement says, unless you let us have gender transition at 12 years old, you're going to cause many of us to kill ourselves.
Mm.
Like, is that the stakes of the game we're talking about right now? Is that really where we want to go with this conversation? Is where you're holding America hostage by saying your mental health is so fragile that you can't, unless you get hormone replacement therapy, you are going to end your life.
Yeah.
I just think that's a terrible way to negotiate with people. And the average American says, here's where the average American is on trans. Frank, the Democratic Party, they should stand up and say, I think that there are some people in America who struggle with their gender identity. I think that's a very real thing. But I think that children should not be able to undergo gender transition therapies, whether it be hormone replacement or, vaginal reconstruction or whatever. When they turn 18, God be with them. Do whatever they want.
Mm.
But we have to understand there's limits to these things. And 10 years ago, we didn't even have this conversation.
Right. And the thing is, where I find the left unreasonable is that they don't understand that it is reasonable for your average person to be threatened by that level of change.
Mm-hmm.
It's all in the red zone of the dial. It's
Mm-hmm.
not like a different view of red wine. Is it better than white wine? And maybe too much drinking will cause some cancer. No, this is gender. That's where we all live.
Mm-hmm. But
This is, a nation state. This is my country. This is where we all live. The left has had a genius for zeroing in on the most unsettling agenda possible. You can't figure anything more than open borders and open gender. It's like, what else can we go for? Motherhood? Yeah, because it isn't mothers anymore. It's parenting.
But let's torque that a little bit though, Frank. Two things that are really stuck in my craw the last couple of years. One is I live in a state that legalized marijuana about 5 years ago for recreational use.
Right.
I think that was a mistake.
Yeah.
I really do. Like the kind of people who are coming into my child's school reeking of marijuana are not the kind of people that, like they're already struggling anyway.
Yes.
They're using this drug in a way that I don't think is productive, and they're smoking in the car with their children.
Yeah.
Like that is not okay, man. Like I'm not cool with that. Like it's everywhere now, and it's a problem. Two, legalized gambling. Sports gambling on the phones has been an absolute scourge on the American public because it's locking especially young men into this downward spiral of betting on everything and anything and losing their shirts.
And what is it about America that means that we're a culture that at one end has charismatic Pentecostal prophets calling down God's wrath on the ungodly, and at the other end, we can't say no to anything. So
That's
basically, we don't know how to legalize porn, but not have it fall into the hands of 8-year-olds.
Mm-hmm.
We don't. We get a little soft on the drug war, and we say, okay, we don't want to put the new Jim Crow. We don't want to put a whole generation in jail, but we can't stop there. What we do is we turn it into a thing where now Bill Maher and everybody else who can laugh about it says, oh well, this is so cool, and yet there's a whole generation of stoners coming on who are lost and are going to be lost forever.
And they're
now
self-medicating.
and gambling's the same thing. So I have a
Absolutely.
question for you as a sort of a student of these things. Why is America on one end, heading to God, but on the other end, the no one can say no to anything.
I
And I
know.
don't think that's left. I don't think that's left right. That's us. That's everybody.
But I think maybe what's causing the one thing is the other thing though, right? Like maybe we're all falling in these despair holes of gambling and marijuana and pornography, going like, why does my life not have meaning and purpose? And some people are crawling out of those despair holes to find religion as a
Right.
way to create structure in their lives and meaning and foundations and morals and all those things that they want. I think
Yeah.
that's probably what's happening is a lot of these young men, especially, are going, God, all my friends are on, FanDuel betting $100 on the Packers game, and they're all smoking marijuana, and they're, and we're talking about what's a woman. Like, I just want something that my grandparents held on to that seemed
Yeah.
like it made their lives meaningful and purposeful and gave them joy and peace and happiness. Russell Brand, which I think he's a
Yes.
charlatan, but
Yeah.
whatever. He said, he had a conversion to Christianity, which
Yeah.
I'm not gonna say anything about that. If you think you do, you do, and it's between you and God. But he said something really smart. He goes, why did I think I was so much smarter than the religion of my grandparents?
Hmm.
And you're not. The thing is,
Yeah.
like, it got your parents through life. It got my grandmother, God bless her. She was born in 1912. She was 17 when the stock market crashed. She buried her first husband in the 60s. She buried her second husband in the 1990s. Lived to be 103. She buried almost every one of her friends. You know what got her through those dark moments? Her
Mm.
belief in God. Her evangelical convictions. And
Sure.
we can talk all day long about evangelicals hating gay people and hating abortion and loving Donald Trump and all those things. But you know what evangelicals do when there's a storm? The first people up there with chainsaws,
Yeah.
cutting
I
those
know.
trees down. On the
Yeah.
border, there were Southern Baptist organizations providing food for migrants as they came across the border, not asking about their immigration status or anything, understanding it's a humanitarian crisis and trying to fix it. So I think we
Yeah.
can cast aspersions at religion all we want, but at the end of the
Yeah.
day, religion does a lot of good things that we don't see and we don't think about.
Yeah, I don't know if you know him because I've only recently discovered him, and maybe you've been reading him for ages. But the British historian Tom Holland,
Tom Holland, yeah, absolutely, yeah.
yeah, who wrote this book Dominion, is one of the great scholars of Roman history
Mm-hmm,
in the United Kingdom, and has a wonderful podcast, by the way,
mm-hmm,
um, called "The Rest Is History"
yeah,
with Dominic Sambrook, who is a columnist, weirdly enough, for the Daily Mail. So sort of the right and left represented. They're wonderful together. But anyway, Tom wrote this book, and I don't know him. I use his first name because I listen to him all the time on The Rest is History, called Dominion.
yeah.
And basically the thesis is this. Look, I was studying Roman history, and I couldn't avoid looking at what happened as the Roman world became Christian.
Mm-hmm,
And when you read a United Nations Declaration of Human Rights or the abolition of slavery, there's no thread that links all this stuff except the teachings of Christ and Paul.
mm,
And while Christianity also enslaved and did all these other terrible things, so did everyone else. The difference is that out of Christianity came modern feminism, the idea of individual rights, and let's remember that.
mm-hmm,
So he doesn't make an argument to become a Christian, but Tom Holland is sort of like a massive dam against this wave of anti-religious sentiment in per se that we
mm-hmm.
now have ascribed to liberals, which I think is one of the things that has pulled the liberal movement down. And I'm one of the premier critics of American Christianity because I came out of it.
Yeah.
And yet, when I read Tom Holland, I'm thinking, wow, this is what ought to be required reading
Mm-hmm.
in women's studies programs that want to find out why feminism happened here and not in Saudi Arabia,
Yeah.
for instance.
I tell people, you don't hate religion, you hate bad religion. That's what you hate. Like
Yeah.
religion, and here's the problem with young people. This is if you ask them what has religion done for America, you know what they're
Yeah.
going to say? Ended Roe versus Wade,
Yeah.
made it harder for gay people to get married, put up all these roadblocks for transgender people, not allow women to be in leadership. But here's what they don't remember. The abolitionist movement in America was driven by Christians.
Yeah.
Okay. The progressive era in America, the temperance movement was a Christian movement, by the way. It was women who did not want their husbands to get drunk and beat the
Yeah.
crap out of them,
Yeah.
which is, by the way, a very good thing that we don't
Yeah.
want, husbands to get drunk and beat the crap out of their wives. But it also led to things like workers' rights, overtime rules, child
Sure.
labor laws. The ballot initiative and referendum was a direct product of the progressive era, driven by social gospelers who believed that God wanted to transform the earth, not just go to heaven, but bring heaven
Sure.
down here. The civil rights movement, If you go back and read the writings of the civil rights leaders, Martin Luther King Jr. was a pastor, but they talked about walking on the Edmund Pettus Bridge, right? And there was all those police officers with batons and
Sure.
dogs, and they said that we prayed to God the dogs would not bite us, and they did not bite us.
Yeah.
Like, you cannot deny the power that religion has to transform society.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, the kind of religion that's left in America is the right-wing conservative version of religion, not the kind of transformative social gospel or version that used to exist for most of American history. So I tell my students, I go, the problem is you don't have any concept of religion that's not conservative. And if
Yeah.
you did, you would understand religion in a more complete way.
Yeah. And when it comes to the individual conservatives, you don't have any idea of the fact that a lot of them are not who you think they are emotionally. But
No,
they do feel as if they've been pushed to the wall on issue after issue.
I'll give you a
And
data point, Frank.
yeah,
I asked, so I got one day I was real grumpy and I was thinking to myself, how can I figure out how many evangelicals are like hateful and hardline? So I tweeted out, can someone put this survey question on a survey for me? And here's the question. Ask evangelicals if you would prefer in America with one of these two scenarios. One is 25% weekly attending evangelicals and 75% nuns, right? So
yeah,
completely polarized. Or 25% weekly evangelicals, 25% mainline Protestants who attend once a month, and 50% nuns.
yeah,
Okay. 86% of evangelicals chose the 25-25-50 scenario. They do not want a world where it's all evangelicals and all nuns. They respect mainline Protestants. They see a
yeah.
value in moderate Christianity in America. But unfortunately, Frank, the problem is the 16% are all you hear about on social
Yeah.
media are the
Well, and
hardliners.
I think to be fair, we've been talking about trans people and so forth. I think that is the same in terms of some of the left.
Absolutely.
That a philosophy professor at UCLA or wherever writes a book saying there's no such thing as sex differences. We hear her quoted a lot, and then somebody takes over the ACLU that's a trans activist, whatever. The fact of the matter is, in terms of the gay community with which I have a lot of exchanges and have sometimes written forwards to book about not praying away the gay and all these things they've suffered from,
Mm-hmm.
you know, I mean, I know it sounds cliche, but going all the way to people like Mel White, who is a gay rights activist in
Yeah.
the evangelical community, these are
Yeah.
my friends. These are people with whom I agree. They are not emailing me saying, "Why aren't you he him?" I've never been accused of any of this stuff by the people who I've known for years in
Mm-hmm.
these movements, including two very dear friends of mine who are trans people, including the daughter of a neighbor of mine who lives across the street,
Mm-hmm.
and so forth. These are some of the gentlest, most kindest people I've ever met. They're
Mm-hmm.
exemplary. They follow Christ, if you want to put it that way, even if they're not Christians in terms of judging people by their actions.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that the extremists and the fanatics in these various movements have betrayed the core of who they even purport to represent. And I
Mm-hmm.
think that's true across the board. I don't know what you think.
So I've got a book coming out with Brazos next spring, 26,
Yeah,
called The Big Church Sort. The title I pitched was The Death of Polite Religion and the Future of America. And
yeah,
it's really about religious polarization. It's like
yeah,
the idea that like these institutions in America, like the Southern Baptist Convention's gone off the rails to the right, because they have.
yeah.
Objectively, that's true. But also atheists have gone off the rails to the left too.
They have.
Richard Dawkins won Humanist of the Year 20 years ago.
Yeah,
They revoked his award. Do you know why, Frank?
no,
Because he said there's only two genders, male and
yeah,
female. So
yeah,
if you don't follow their orthodoxy,
yeah,
you're out. Guess what? You're doing exactly what evangelicals do, man. You're doing
yeah,
exactly what they're doing. And so the end of the book is I give a couple prescriptions on like how for us to survive this moment. And
yeah,
one of them is to label extreme views as extreme views.
yeah,
Because on social media, you don't realize someone says something like nutty and you're like, wait a minute, is that what most people believe? Like you don't know like how luckily for me, I do this kind of work all the time, so
yeah.
I know what a nutty belief system is. For instance, you know what percentage of white evangelicals think that abortion is murder and women should be jailed for seeking an abortion?
Tell us.
20%.
Yeah,
20% of white evangelicals think abortion's murder and women should go to prison for getting an abortion. That's of white evangelicals. In the entire population, it is 6%. 6% of Americans hold that view. And yet, if you
yeah,
go online, it feels like half of Americans believe that to be true. So
yeah,
what I tell those people is you've got three options. One is to try to convince the rest of America that you're right, which is exactly what you should do, by the way, because this is America. We believe in free speech here.
yeah,
Two is to force it down our throats through legislation, which doesn't usually end well. Let's be honest here. Like the
Yeah.
prohibition movement was not a shining
Well, and
success.
I don't want to get a thousand furious letters, but Roe v. Wade didn't end well either.
No, and by the way, even well, Ruth Bader Ginsburg was actually not a fan of Roe v. Wade.
No,
FYI.
I know that. I
I
know
mean,
that.
let's be clear. I think Roe v. Wade, from a pure legalistic standpoint, was a terrible decision.
Yeah.
Um, and then the third thing is, so you got to convince us, you got to force it on our throats, or you've got the burn it all down approach, which I think more and more people are going towards the burn it all down approach. And
Yeah.
I think Donald Trump, by the way, is the burn it all down candidate, which I think
Yes,
one of the
he's a
reasons
burn
he
it
gets.
all down guy. And if you look at the people he's nominated, it really looks like, it's the anarchic program of 1968 in Paris.
Exactly.
Build the barricade and fight the cops. I mean, literally, those are his people. Now he's going to pardon them.
Throw out the bums. And
Throw
here's
out
the
the
thing:
bums.
we ask people like, "What comes afterwards?" You know what they say? I don't care. I
Hey,
don't care.
après moi le déluge.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And I think that's the problem is we've got to call extreme people extreme and just
Yeah.
label them as that. Otherwise, it creates this weird thing where we think we're weird for not believing what they believe, and that's not true at all.
But I need to ask you a question as an observer of all this, and this is not rhetorical. I'm not fishing for anything. I really mean, please inform me.
Mm-hmm.
How do you talk to the media all the time? So
Mm-hmm.
you're talking to what used to be the gatekeepers.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Now we're the gatekeepers, you and me today. We're the media as much as Ruth Graham at the Times is,
You're right. You're
aren't
right.
we? Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Absent new media like me that is sensible, moderate, and well informed, ha ha ha, to talk about my podcast. Um, with no gatekeepers, what hope is there for any kind of truth on every front that we've talked about, whether it's gender or politics or smoking dope at home or legalization of this or self-driving cars? What I don't understand, part of the instability is just this question of no one knows where to go for any actual information, which, by the way, put in another plug for Tom Holland and Dominic Sandbrook and their podcast, The Rest of His History. Jeannie and I are surviving the post-election trauma of Trump back in office. Saying that a little facetiously because I'm not traumatized, but
Mm-hmm.
because I know enough history to understand this is just another turn of the wheel.
Mm-hmm.
That said, where does the public, left, right, center, these young men going to church, when they look up from the church experience or whatever they're into, where do they
Yeah.
go for any information that they can sort of just say, yeah, I mean, this was in the New York Times, the equivalent, or it was on network television. So here's an actual study. So here you are, you're a writer, you're turning out analysis, you're helping media people frame their stories.
Mm-hmm.
But nobody trusting anything coming from the establishment, in a way, it isn't being that close to the successful gatekeepers a kind of a loss.
I think you're really touching on the real outcome of this decentralization, deinstitutionalization of American life, right?
Yeah.
I mean, we look back at Walter Cronkite and go, I wish we could go back to those days, but it's not like Walter Cronkite was perfect. He was
No, he
fallible.
wasn't.
Like he made mistakes. He was pretty establishment in some ways,
Well,
especially in
and the
Vietnam.
editors of the New York Times missed the religion story for 50 years. So
I mean,
Hillary Clinton woke up one morning, everybody says, what the hell happened? And I knew what had happened. And I know this will sound weird and personal and anecdotal, because when my dad's book, A Christian Manifesto, in 1982, sold 1 million copies in a couple of years after it came out and changed the whole way so many evangelicals were looking, and the whole Seven Mountains thing came out of it and all the rest, it never got reviewed, and it was outselling their bestsellers 3-1.
mm-hmm.
And yet it didn't exist for them.
But think about, I mean, like the Iraq War was basically a media creation. Like they propped up the Bush administration during that period of time. So let's not act like there was some grand time in American history when the media was all, and before that it was yellow journalism, by the way. Like in the pre-war period, it was all propaganda on both sides.
And if you look at the newsreels from 1944 or 45 or whatever, basically it's just, our boys and this and that. And you know perfectly well that it's all bullshit.
Yeah. But I think, okay, so here's the thing. I think the big difference now is that like we've decentralized. So you can follow them, you can pay me to provide you information, which that wasn't possible 10 or 15 years ago. Like Substack has been a revolution as far as I can tell. And like you should pay people for the information that you think is as unbiased as possible. Not unbiased, because every piece of information has a bias to it. Every human being has a bias. I do. I'm a white male Christian living in rural America. That's my bias. Now, do I try to steer against that bias? Every day. But I'm still biased because I can only see the world in my limited perspective. But you should give money to people that you think are trying to do what I just described. If you want to see more of that, that's how you support that. If you want to give it to charlatans and extremists, go right
Yeah.
ahead. But you know what that's going to lead to? More charlatans and more
Well, and
extremists.
speaking of which, I'll put in a plug for you in that I follow your work, and this is absolutely true of you. You know, your analysis, you might say what your bias is, but it's straight down the middle, real stuff. Um, in your book, and I'm looking forward to both new books, by the way.
Mm-hmm.
But the other thing is, I'll just put a little plug in for In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer, because we get emails from people saying, well, if you interview a person like that, I'm never watching your show again, because I actually have interviewed the editor of the Wall Street Journal, who's a Rupert Murdoch employee, because I want to know what he thinks.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm polite and I talk to him.
Yeah. And guess what you're going to
And
find out? He's a normal
yeah, and
human
I'm
being.
interviewing you. So anybody who follows In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer is hearing from trans activists who have written books on the things that, you know, I would critique and not agree with. And they're getting reviews of books by a young female Black American activist who's all about racial segregation and, you know, the iniquity of the white community, of which I'm one.
Mm-hmm.
And yet we're talking like human beings. And then people from the right and from the left. What interests me is that it seems to me that this is more shocking sometimes to the people who would say they agree with me on the left on my quote positions than it is to a lot of people who are supposed to be bigots on the right.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll have on a trans activist who's written a book about her transition, and I don't get any shit from people who are still watching me because my name is Schaeffer. It's
Mm-hmm.
like, well, you know, Frank talks to a lot of different people. The shit I get is from people on the left who are supposedly open-minded liberals, but it's not a liberalism I recognize. And it's
Mm-hmm.
like we're never going to watch your podcast again because you interviewed fill in the blank. It might
Mm-hmm.
be whoever it is.
Mm-hmm. To
Didn't
me,
you know
that's
she writes for the Daily Mail? Don't you know? You know, blah
I
blah blah.
don't care.
Me
Like,
neither.
listen, Frank. One time there was a graph I tweeted out, and there was some liberal theologian who, in the comments, noted that I'd written for the Gospel Coalition,
God
which is
forfend.
God forbid that I write for
Yeah,
the Gospel Coalition.
yeah,
For God's sake, I can only write for like Christian Century, I suppose, and be
yes,
part of the team. That's
yeah.
what kills me is like, no, I will write for literally anyone, left,
Me
right, or
too.
center. I do not care.
And I will interview anybody on this show who presents themselves in a halfway decent, a non-fanatical manner.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm interested. It is the exact opposite with me. You know, I enjoy talking to people who have a totally different lived experience than me and have drawn opposite conclusions. And more than that, some of the books I've read to interview podcast people on this podcast has changed my mind on some specific issue.
What a crazy idea, Frank.
Yeah,
The
I look
idea
at
that,
things differently now because I read a book and I checked it out and they were telling the truth and I was wrong.
yeah, there's nothing wrong with saying I was wrong about that, or my
Yeah,
thinking has evolved on this issue, or I read this thing, or my life also my life has changed too. You know, I mean, I
yeah,
had different opinions when I was 22 years old than I had
yeah, me
42 years
too.
old. Like I got married, I had two kids, I got a job, I got a little bit of money, I got
Well, and
like
you'll
my
know about this because you write and you're writing books. One of the you know, I'm 72 now, so that's the perspective. One of the liabilities of being a writer is I had people coming to me saying, and such a book on such and such a page, you said this. And I'm like, yeah, but that was then. And
exactly.
I'm 20 years further into my journey. And by the way, I don't even agree with that now.
Oh, it already happens to me. Like stuff I wrote 5 years ago, like I didn't have a full understanding of the thing I was writing about, or a
Right.
fuller under. And now, the more I'm doing this work, the more I'm understanding it better. And it's like you. I tell my students, I go, here's the problem that we do. We look back at our younger selves with our current wisdom and go, look how stupid I was.
Yeah,
That's so unfair to your prior version of you.
it is. Yeah.
You can't expect a 20-year-old to have a 60-year-old's wisdom.
Yeah.
So did you do the best you could with the situation you had? That's
Yeah.
the only thing that matters. And I think
Yeah.
hopefully people have a little bit of grace with both of us,
Yeah.
as we evolve in our thinking, that we're not going to be in the same place in 20 years. And thank God for that.
Yeah, and I feel exactly the same about younger people. You know, you get these people protesting on campus about Palestine and so forth, and they're young and they're stupid, blah, 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 blah. And I'm thinking, you know, 18, 20, 21, 22. Um, I'm 72 years old. Of course, my perspective is a little different, but are you kidding me? You know, why are we making war on young people for being young?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, what's the
Mm-hmm.
matter with that? Like of course they're young and untutored in some way or overly expressive or fanatical. And then I try to remember, okay, wait a minute. my first paying job was helping with the light show at the Strobe Club in Montreux for the Led Zeppelin. Who was that kid? And he wasn't one who'd be sitting here having this conversation because I've read a few
No,
books in between.
no, and that's okay. I'm a college professor. I'm on college campuses. I
Yeah,
want my students to do dumb things sometimes and believe
yeah,
dumb things and I tell them in the classroom, this is to use a liberal word, this is a
yeah,
safe space. You know what I
yeah,
mean? Like you can throw out a crazy idea in this
sure.
classroom. I don't care. Let's
Yeah,
debate it. Let's discuss it. Let's work. Like my job is to be both sides. So if
yeah.
you throw a really liberal idea at me, I'm going to throw you a really conservative idea back.
And I
I'm going to
think,
give you the
yeah, go
best.
ahead.
My job, I think
Yeah.
my job as a professor is to give you the best version of the other side of the argument.
Yeah,
Not the,
I love your ideas about cutting yourself some slack as you look back
yeah,
and passing that on to younger people now. And I have felt that, is one of the great pitfalls of old lefties, but also old people from the right. I mean, it's like, hey, man, everybody's got to cut their teeth on something. And how do you expect wisdom at every turn?
that's none of us have not gone through life without doing one thing we really, really regret.
Yeah,
Like
or half a dozen.
or two yesterday.
Yeah,
I mean that's just growing up. And I think, but here's to go back to pay people that you care about, that you think are doing good work.
yeah,
You need to I think people pay for my Substack because they trust my judgment. If that
yeah,
makes any sense, right? Like
yeah,
they understand they're going with me on a journey of discovery in the world of religion and politics, and
yeah,
I'm their tour guide. And they get to go through instead of just me doing it in my head, I do it on the page twice a week.
yeah,
And it's a discipline because now I'm working out to use a Pauline term, working out my salvation with fear and trembling. I'm
yeah.
working out how I understand the world of religion and politics out in the public. So you're not paying for the content as much as you're paying to go with me on the journey through the content to try to
Well, and
understand the
finding
world better.
someone whose opinion you trust. And I've come
Exactly.
to trust your opinion by reading your material.
I
So,
appreciate
you
that, Frank.
certainly get my tick the
Oh,
box.
appreciate
As
that.
far as my recommendation goes, people ought to be talking to Ryan and listening to him.
Well,
By
not
the
too many
way,
people, Frank. I'm busy.
when I say, I mean euphemistically, buying
Yeah.
your product.
Yes.
When we wrap this up here, don't go away. I'm going to say goodbye, not now, but in a moment. And when I
Yeah.
do, please say and talk to my producer, Ernie,
I will.
for two reasons. First of all, we need all the links you want to be linked to go up everywhere this goes up. So we're helping promote you.
Okay.
Okay. Secondly, we want to book you again to talk about both of your new books. And we want to be early in the process. And third, we want to book anybody you think we ought to be talking to.
Ooh, I've got so many academic friends who would love to come on the show and
Yeah, but I mean, like who you think have something to say that there's a lot of people we don't know. We find half of our good guests by other people saying, "Hey, have you thought of what's her name?"
I love that. That's what actually one of the joys I've had in getting to my position in this world is I get to point reporters to other people that are in my sphere that maybe aren't as well known as I am and say,
Yeah.
this person knows more about this than I do. Like
Well,
really,
point us to some people, and they can be anybody. Hey, they can be famous or not famous, or an author or not an author. We
mhm,
don't care about gender. We don't care about political affiliation. We just want to talk to interesting people who know something.
that's I I always joke with people when I was young, I didn't pray to God to be rich or famous or attractive. I just prayed to
Yeah.
God to be interesting
Yeah, there you are.
because that's the most
Which is
important thing.
almost Salomaic. It's almost like wisdom.
I was pretty dumb in a lot of things, but that I always saw through all the crap and was
Yeah.
like, because here's the thing about being interesting. Interesting makes you rich. Interesting makes you famous. Interesting does
Yeah.
everything that gets added to you if you're interesting. Like,
Yeah.
you know what you never said, Frank? That guy's too interesting. No
Yeah,
one's ever
that's right.
said
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
Like, you
No.
can't be too interesting. You can be a lot of things. Too rich, too pretty, too smart. You can't
Yeah.
be too interesting.
Yeah. Speaking of Donald Trump, so he may be a con artist or a crook, but he is interesting.
Oh, that's the problem with the left is the left act like that he's like the most horrible person. The guy is fun to watch on television. I don't care what you say. If
Yeah.
he's on, I'm going to watch it because he's going to say, like today, he said he wanted to call the Gulf of America, not the Gulf of Mexico. That's a great bit. That's hilarious. I love that. He wants to
Yeah.
buy Greenland. Oh my God, that's so funny.
Yeah.
Obviously there's some really tragic stuff in there with like
Yeah.
January 6th and all the other, but like at the end of the day, like you got to understand there's a reason people vote for the guy. He's
Yeah. Exactly
charismatic.
right. And it isn't because they're all fascist terrorists.
No, you're not a racist if you vote for Trump, and you're not a baby killer if you vote for Democrats either. Let's be clear about that.
Yeah. Here, here, here. Hey, stick around and talk to my redoubtable, wonderful producer, Ernie Gregg. And he will get your information so we can post it everywhere. We will talk about rebooking you to promote your new books, talk about getting copies of the new book early enough so I can read it. And then please give him the names of some people. And by the way, after that conversation, if in a week or so you say, hey, Frank ought to talk to so-and-so, or a year from now, pass it on to Ernie, because that's where we get our good guests.
I would love to do that.
Thank you. And is there
Thanks.
anything else before we wrap up here that A, you'd like to promote, or B, just say, or to wrap up a point where you didn't feel we said enough?
Graphsaboutreligion.com. That's really the main hub of everything I do. It's my newsletter on Substack, comes out on Mondays and Thursdays. Most of it's free. There is a paid tier, but most of it's free.
Yeah.
It's exactly what you think it is. I thought about a fun name for a long time, and I was like, nah, screw that. Let's go direct. Graphs About Religion. That's
Yeah.
exactly what it is. If you just want some data driven, trying to be neutral, trying to be unbiased, just trying to explain the world as it is, not the way you
Yeah.
want it to be, but as it
Yeah.
actually
Yeah.
exists. That's my goal there. So if you could follow me there, I'd really appreciate it.
Well, I would urge people to follow you there. I do. I look at your graphs. I look at the information. I see it all picked up in national stories a few weeks later. You're way ahead of the curve on all of this stuff. So, I'm giving you my 5-star billing, if I may, and just tell people to follow Ryan and check him out.
Thanks, Frank. It's been a